If you're a teacher, you probably already know that being consistent is very important to classroom management. And you also probably struggle with being consistent. My name is Roxana Eldon, and in the 20 years that I've been working with teachers, I've found that the best way to make classroom management advice work is to break it down into 3 steps. First, why it actually is good advice in the first place. Second, why it's sometimes easier said than done. And then third, how to make it easier to do. So let's start with what being consistent is and why it is good advice. Being consistent on the most basic level is just, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. If you tell a kid that you're going to call their parent if they keep misbehaving, you call the parent. If you say, I won't call on you unless you're raising your hand quietly, you don't call on a student who's not raising their hand quietly. If you promise them a pizza party if they get 100 compliments in the hallway and the paper compliment chain reaches all the way across the classroom wall, they get that pizza party eventually. There's something that's a little bit obvious about why it's a good idea to do what you say, but I want to also go into some of the deeper reasons why it's a good idea to be consistent in your classroom. First of all, students have kind of a fairness radar. I would argue maybe so do adults, and there is some evidence that other primates like gorillas even respond to unfairness at a certain level. But back to the kids. They respond better to rules that apply to everyone, and they like when promises are kept. Second reason, students who are following the rules want to know that you know who's not following the rules. And if they're following the rules, they want to feel like the rules mean something. On the flip side, there are students who get in trouble a lot. If they see that a student who gets in trouble less often than them also sometimes gets a consequence for not following rules, they know that you just haven't decided you don't like them, that you are just there to enforce the rules. And I feel like very few people would disagree that it is good for all of these things to happen in your classroom, and you undoubtedly mean to be the type of teacher who does all of these things. However, being consistent can be easier said than done. And there are 3 main reasons for that. First of all, students don't have consistent needs. Sometimes one student, for whatever reason, takes up way more of your attention and energy than most of the other students in the class. You may even have students with diagnosed behavioral disorders who have trouble controlling their behavior, or just who knows what's going on. But there can be situations where it's hard to know if you should hold a specific student to the same standard. The second reason is that students don't have consistent behavior. Some students behave so well so much of the time that if they break a rule, there's a part of you that wants to let it slide. Especially if, it's the first offense. Maybe they're having a bad day. It's so easy to just let them get away with it. At the same time, you don't want to seem like you're favoring anyone. You may even have moments where you're tempted to really give a consequence to a normally well-behaved kid just to show the students who are getting in trouble that it's not just them. And that brings us to the last reason that being consistent is so hard, which is that you're not so consistent yourself. You, of course, want to be fair, but you're human. You get tired, you get distracted. There are a million things happening at once. Sometimes you can't respond to everything you see. Sometimes you don't see everything that happens. So, how do you make it easier to be consistent in your classroom? And notice what I'm not saying is, how can you be better at being consistent? Because what you really want to avoid as a teacher is these kind of New Year's resolution style promises. Giving yourself an ongoing guilt trip about how important something is will not make you do it in the long term. We want to make this easier to do because it's important and because you're going to be just as human tomorrow as you were yesterday. So how do you make being consistent easier to do? First of all, if you want to keep your promises, one way you can do that is to promise fewer things. If a student has been misbehaving in class, instead of saying, I'm going to call your parents, I'm going to call your parents, I'm going to call your parents, maybe don't tell them you're going to call their parents. Just call at the end of the day. And if you don't get to it, or the number doesn't work, or the parent isn't home, the kid isn't in there tomorrow like, you said you were going to call my parents and you didn't. On the flip side of that, Maybe don't promise a pizza party if you're not in the end going to do a pizza party. Or in my case, that story about the paper compliment chain is very personal, because when I taught 4th grade, I promised these kids a pizza party if they got enough compliments in the hallway for the paper loop chain to reach across the room. And then you know what happened? It turned out I had to stand on a chair at the end of each day to staple these paper chain loops together. And I just never got around to doing that. So I had like a shelf with maybe 30 compliments in it and a paper loop chain with maybe 5 rings on it. And it never reached across the room. And the kids never got a pizza party. So don't be that person, which is me. But either way, if you haven't promised, you haven't threatened, you didn't lose credibility, you didn't break a promise. The same thing applies to classroom routines. So for example, if you say you're going to reassign seats every quarter, and little by little, those intentions fall away and you may stop doing them, what if you just hadn't announced that? There's no reason not to have a note in your own calendar, but the students don't need to know that you are planning that. The students need to know the stuff that is relevant for them to do. And even on that, sometimes they'll follow your lead and you don't have to make an announcement every time you change that a little bit. The next tip on how to make being consistent easier to do is the students won't always know if you're just pretending not to notice something. If an offense is not that serious and you just can't deal with it right now, it could be better if the kids just think you didn't notice it. That way, you're not being inconsistent. They just think their classmate got away with something, and maybe he or she won't next time. Not always recommended, but it is an option, and you should keep that in mind. Another way to make things easier to do is just to literally make them easier to do. Remove friction. If there are extra steps in keeping up with the routine, try to eliminate some of those steps. One example would be that compliment chain. I never stapled the compliment loops to the compliment chain, and at least part of the reason for that was that I had to stand on a chair at the end of the day when I was already tired and already had so many other things to do. That was just so far down the priority line that even though it's not that big of a deal to stand on a chair, when was the last time you got something out of your attic or the back of your closet or your basement or your garage? When was the last time you left a store to go back to your car to go get a reusable shopping bag? These little steps of friction really can be the difference between a tired person being consistent or not. So if you can remove a step, remove it. Another thing to try, turn follow-up into classroom jobs. So you as a teacher have countless jobs each day, but kids enjoy being helpful, and there are a lot of jobs that a student who's focused only on that job can actually do better than an overwhelmed teacher who's adding that to their plate. And an example of this would be in kindergarten. There's often a student whose job it is to just take one of those calendar numbers and just place it into the calendar pocket for that day's date. If the teacher had to do that every single day, I wouldn't be surprised if it sometimes said the wrong date on that calendar. So what I really should have done, looking back with the compliment chain, I should have moved it down so I didn't have to stand on a chair. That would have eliminated friction. But what I also should have done was have a contest where when we got back to the classroom, whoever remembered that the compliment loop needed to go on the compliment chain would get out of their seats and go staple it and then go back to their seat. And then it would be completely off my plate. And it would be consistent without me having to be better at being consistent. You getting better is technically always possible, but it's often not the best option because it's hard to get better. A lot of us are working pretty close to the capacity that we can maintain most of the time. Another thing that can help you be more consistent, get enough sleep. A well-rested person doesn't get as distracted, isn't as forgetful, and doesn't overreact as often to frustrations. So all of those things are part of consistency. And finally, when in doubt, give yourself a little credit and forgiveness, because being consistent is a work in progress. It's not something you are or you're not. It's something that you're always striving for and always falling a little short. And even aiming to be as consistent as you can every day is a consistent practice. I break down all of the most common pieces of classroom management advice in my free classroom management troubleshooting guide, which you can find linked in the description below this video. I'll also be covering some of these topics in upcoming videos, so feel free to subscribe and stick around. And if there is a piece of teaching advice that you'd like me to break down into 3 parts like this, please let me know in the comments, and I will try to make a video about it in the future. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.